currently much for so. Mick Donald for the House. Chief to students. In addition, we have a full quarter of great events for everyone. You can join us tomorrow night at 5:30 p.m. at the International House for Night at the Coliseum, a history of political conventions in Chicago, and then again on Thursday at 5 p.m. in Bond Chapel in the Quad for Burning Tech, The Master Speaks with Kara Swisher. With that, please join me in welcoming Mick Mulvaney, Andrew Card, Bill Daley, and Mack McLarty, and the IOP's Senior Director, Jennifer Steinhauer, for All Hail the Chief of Staff.
Exactly.
Hello, fellas. It is all fellas. That's not their fault. There's never been a male in the White House or a female chief of staff or a female president yet. So don't blame them. But here's our fellas. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate you flying in, coming from all your far-flung places to join us. As you can see, there's a lot for the president. Usually, when we have these conversations, I kind of pepper things around a lot. Tonight, it'll be a little different because I'm really curious to see. I'm really curious to see Washington having changed so much as it has in that period of time. How much the role of the chief of staff to the president has and hasn't changed. So I may be asking a lot of you some of the same questions, but I think it was interesting because I was reading up, preparing for this event, and I was looking through the biography of James Baker, Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, probably the chief of staff to chiefs of staff, wouldn't you say? And Peter Baker and Susan Glasser's biography of him, and they said he kind of rejected this high-minded concept like loyalty or being an honest broker as the most important aspect of being a chief of staff. He was asked by a New York Times reporter to describe the most important skill that a White House chief of staff needs to possess, and he said that skill was shit detector. He said, it's my job to keep the president from getting into trouble, and when he gets into trouble, to get him out of it. So I wanted to kind of open with that notion, given the role he plays sort of in the history of chiefs of staff to presidents. And I wanted to go down the line and see if you could just remind everybody which president you worked for, and if you agree with that, and if that's not the main characteristic that you thought you brought to the job, what was the central thing that you brought that either got you chosen for the role or that you think was central to you executing it for the president?
And you want me to start right off?
You're in the hot seat. You can do it.
Well, I'm very blessed. I worked for 3 presidents at the White House: President Ronald Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President George W. Bush. And the first thing I would say is, if you want to be the chief of staff, don't apply for the job. I don't know anyone who applied for the job that got the job, so it's not, and the president doesn't go to monster.com or Indeed looking for one. So the first responsibility is to acknowledge the responsibility that's been given. And I'll just tell you my story. When I was asked to be the president's chief of staff, I thought he was really asking me to run his transition into government. And then he made it pretty clear that he was talking about, quote, the big one. And he didn't give a definition to the word big until after the election and the hanging chads had all fallen to the ground. And
now let's don't go there, Andy. Okay? I chaired Gore's campaign a few times in counting chads.
No, but seriously, when he said that, he asked me, it was the morning after the election when he asked me to be his chief of staff. And I said, we have a lot to talk about. I said, first of all, if I become your chief of staff, I will be a staffer in charge of the staff. I cannot be your friend. You're my friend, and I don't want to let you down, but I cannot be your friend. You can't be afraid to come at me with all kinds of things because you don't want to hurt your friend. No, you've got permission to hurt me. Number two, I said, if I don't have your cadence of life and live my cadence the same way you live your cadence, we'll be incompatible. I'm an early morning person, he's an early morning person. So his cadence of what time do you get up, what time do you go to bed, what do you like to do you exercise, do you do devotions, what's your cadence like? I want to know your cadence so that I can adjust to your cadence and not try to impose a cadence on you that you feel would be threatening. You have to allow me to say truth to power. And I'm not going to be afraid to say truth to power, and you shouldn't be afraid to challenge me. Then I said, you have to have the courage to fire me when you want me to be fired.
Okay.
And I would respect it. And finally I said, my wife is my partner in everything I do. If my wife cannot be my partner as I'm being your chief of staff, it won't work. That doesn't mean that she should work at the White House, but if she is not in my life, I won't have anybody helping to carry the burdens. I won't share the secrets with her, but I definitely want to share the burden with her. And he said, of course, I love Kathy. And I said, no, you don't count. What does Laura think? And so he said, let's go talk to her. We went out in the kitchen and talked to Laura Bush. I had the privilege of working under President Reagan, where I saw Jim Baker be chief of staff as part of a troika, Baker meets Deaver. I don't think that was Jim Baker's best time, and I don't think it was the best model for a chief of staff. When Jim Baker became chief of staff alone, I think he was the very best chief of staff. So it's also what's the authority that the president gives you to help build a staff and build camaraderie in the White House. And finally, I'm going to quote from a professor from Harvard, Roger B. Porter, who wrote books on the White House organization. He said the chief of staff's role, and I think all of my colleagues would agree with it, first one is the care and feeding of the president. You want to make sure the president is able to make brutally tough decisions anytime, anywhere, any day, which means you have to pay attention to his state of mind, his emotional health, his spiritual health, his physical health, or his clear thinking. So that's number one, the care and feeding the president. You never talk about that as a job for a chief of staff, but it really is. And by the way, you all want to be president because you're very well cared for. His luggage doesn't get lost. Air Force One shows up, the gasoline is in the motorcade, the car gets there on time, the pencils are on the desk, the phone works. If you're the president, you're pretty well cared for. You worry about the country, you don't worry about the little things, and so that's a big part of the job. The second part of the job is what you all think about, and that's policy formulation. And usually that's not giving advice on policy, it's disciplining the people who are giving advice on policy not to bully other people out of the process and to make sure the president doesn't get monolithic counsel. And the final thing is, Roger Porter said, is marketing and selling. If the president makes a decision and nobody knows about it, did a president make a decision? And the answer is no. The White House doesn't get to implement any decision. It's implemented by other people in government or by Congress or the United Nations, the king or a queen or a potentate. So you have to communicate what the president's decisions are in such a way that they will be respected, and when they're implemented, they'll live up to the president's expectation. So that's what I learned by watching the chiefs of staff who served President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and these gentlemen that served other presidents.
So we've set the table pretty well, and I think we're going to unpack as we go along the different segments about speaking truth to power and what care and feeding means. This question is about your secret, your superpower. Yours was, I think, Kathy, early morning, and I assume coffee. So what was your secret power?
Well, there are no secrets anymore in Washington. So, but first of all, after all those conditions, Andy, I'm shocked you got the job. But I was with President Obama in 11, right after a disastrous election, 2010, when the Tea Party took over.
Disastrous? I thought it was pretty good. What are you talking about?
I'm talking about for America.
I got it.
And I'm in the middle of this.
Anyway, no. Mick and I are good friends. And I think Baker's comment about basically being, forget the phrase and I won't use it, but that's because nothing comes into the Oval Office that's good, basically.
Yeah.
Because if it has to be decided by the president, nobody else wants to make the decision and he's got to make it. So it's generally a bad situation. But each of these, even though the job has been around for a while, it really is about the president's style and how you react to that. Everything Andy laid out about President Bush 43 was absolutely accurate. And so you've got to have a sense of that. I knew President Obama nowhere near as well as like Andy knew or Mack knew the two presidents they served with. So his style was very different. But the bottom line is you've got to be honest, you've got to be direct, and also try to keep away as Andy said, and I think my colleagues would say the same, the most important thing may be to speak truth to power. And I used to love how so-called powerful people would come into the Oval Office, especially business leaders. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to tell them this. And I'd say, okay, sure.
That's right.
And they get in there and they melt. And, they say, well, you're doing a great job. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just said he was crazy or something. So anyway, but then to filter that and basically say to the president, here's what he really wanted to tell you. And after the fact, not in front of him, embarrass him. But so the number one quality is you have to be honest with the president.
So we're going to talk about the honesty and the ups and the pros and cons of honesty. What about you, sir? What do you think was now you, of course, you were in a special situation because you had known the president really your whole lives, right? So that's a different kind of relationship going into it. Was that your greatest asset, or do you think it was something else?
Well, I would say, first of all, just let me say, Jennifer, I'm delighted and I feel like it's a privilege to be here, both on this on this campus of the Venerable Institution and with my fellow chiefs. That's number one. Number two, I think the way I viewed it is trust is the coin of the realm, as George Shultz said. I think to be a chief of staff, you've got to have a high measure of trust and respect, mutual respect with the president in order to do your job effectively. Jennifer, you're right. I had known the president from childhood. We were lifelong friends, but I had never worked with or for him when he was governor for 10 years in our state. I had been a businessman. I had helped him establish the Democratic Leadership Council, the New Democrat movement, which he ran on, Bill, as you'll remember. Great to be in your hometown, by the way, Mr. Daley. Public services and Daley's and Chicago are all kind of symbiotic. So that was a new experience. I did not expect to serve in his administration. I was chairman and chief executive of a New York Stock Exchange natural gas company. And it's my wonderful wife of 50-plus years, Donna will tell you, we had one son at Georgetown and a senior at Little Rock Central in Little Rock, so I had no anticipation I would serve. The president asked me the night after the election to consider serving as chief of staff, and I remember the Howard Baker story, who was married to Joy Dirksen, the venerable senator here from Illinois, who had been the minority leader, Mick, as you'll remember, and he was chief of staff to President Reagan later. But he came in, he was asked to see Reagan, Andy, in the Oval Office during a difficult period, and he told Joy Dirksen, there's no way I'm going to take that job. It's too difficult. It's a chief javelin catcher. I'm not going to do that. He gets in with President Reagan. He said, Howard, I'm in trouble. I need you. The country needs you. And Howard Baker said, yes, sir, I'll be honored to serve. The point in my case, here you had a lifelong friend, a governor of your home state, compatible on political philosophy, asking you to serve him, support him, and serve the country. And clearly the answer after reflection and discussion is yes, sir, it'll be an honor to do so.
And did you feel that that personal friendship, you talked about having to put the friendship piece away. Were you able to do that? Or do you think you were always advising him as a childhood friend, as a lifelong
No,
confidant?
I think we had that understanding, and over our careers, we'd already developed kind of that different relationship, maintaining a friendship, but a different type of relationship that was separate from that. And what he really, and I asked him, I said, well, why do you think I would be the right person to be chief of staff? I'd been actively involved in politics, been on the Democratic National Committee and so forth, again, simpatico from a political standpoint, but still had not expected to serve. He said, I need someone I can trust, who's compatible, and will keep me, be a reality check, and keep me straight and tell me the truth and tell me when we're not doing things right. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of relationship we had. And I must say, and I had, again, never worked with or for Governor Clinton, he took criticism well. I mean, I always offered it in private. It was respectful. He knew it was not going to be a leak and see it in the Washington Post. Sometimes he didn't like it, but he understood we had the kind of relationship that it worked.
Well, you've set up some tantalizing entrees here because we're going to talk some more about when you had to say these tough things. So you worked for a president who we've kind of talked about, three completely different presidents over a generation, but the norms sound basically the same. You worked for a president who looked more different style than those guys probably in terms of norms and how he administered and how that White House ran. Do you concur with these gentlemen about what was important for you and how you got the job and how you were able to run it?
Yeah, as I was listening to the other three gentlemen talk, I'm imagining the Venn diagram of the four different sort of perspectives that we have, and there's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot that's very, very different. I had a different relationship with Donald Trump from the beginning. I had actually worked for him before. I was the Office of Management and Budget Director, and if you go back and you look, I think there's like 6 or 8 of us who have become Chief of Staff after that position. After the Chief, the OMB Director is probably with the President as much as anybody else. I was the only person who took the job for Trump who had actually known him. Reince didn't know him. Reince Priebus didn't know him. John Kelly had worked for him in a cabinet secretary, physically remote. And then Mark Meadows came out of Congress. But I had worked with Trump for a year, so I knew what I was getting into. And I had a laugh, and Andy said, if you want the job, don't ask for it. I went in on a Friday night because I was working 2 jobs at the time. I was the OMB director, and I ran a place called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that job had just stopped. And I wanted more to do. I had been working 2 full-time jobs for a year, and I walked in to ask to be the special envoy to Northern Ireland, which is a job I had always wanted. And Trump goes, great idea, we'll do it afterwards, chief first. And he did not ask for trust. That was not what the relationship was about. He wanted somebody to fix things. He knew that the place was busted. He knew that it was a bad environment with John Kelly having been there. And the president and the former chief did not get along, and the morale in the building was really bad. And he thought what I had done at OMB and then at CFPB was sort of, in his mind, a turnaround, and that's what he wanted. He should come in and fix things, which is why it was always an acting position, even though I was there 15 months and probably on the job longer than the other 3 guys. It was always there for a purpose, which was to turn the place around. But when you talked about the cadence of life, I remember sitting there going, because I didn't expect to be offered the chief's job. I went in, my wife was actually waiting for me in my office to go to dinner, and I'm like, how am I going to explain this? And I said, boss, I can't do what you do. He's like, what do you mean? He said, you only sleep like 4 hours a night. I can't do that. He goes, well, how do you want to do it? I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll work from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. And I'll have a team come in at noon that works till 2. And he slept every night from about 2 until 6. And I said, and that way you've got coverage. And he said, got it, that's great. By the way, he always respected that. He only called me 1 time after hours the entire time I worked there, and I'm still to this day think he just lost track of time. He called me at 11, he could tell, he said, I'm really sorry, he hung up the phone. So he respected the boundaries. But it was a different kind of relationship. I talked to you a little bit before I took the gig, and I talked to Josh Bolton. And I can't remember how I found you. I know I found Josh because Josh had been the OMB director.
Robert O'Brien.
It was Robert O'Brien, that's exactly right. And I read the book. I ran home and read the book on gatekeepers about how to be a good chief of staff, right? The only supposed manual. And I'm sitting there going, okay, this is what it, and I remember you said it a little bit, but Josh said it a lot, and this goes to your question. There is no archetype, right? There is no one perfect chief of staff. It has to be different depending upon the president, and oftentimes depending upon, it can change from president to president. You could be in a first term, a second term, you could be going into it a re-elect, coming out of re-elect.
Yeah.
What a good chief of staff is can always be different. And that's the one takeaway I meant. So that fits. So you got the 4 Venn diagrams, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 things that all fit together. But then there's also things that are going to be unique to Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton.
Yeah, that's right.
That's interesting, too, because I think I read a story recently that Zients has a completely different way of doing things than Ron Klain, for example, very different style. So it's not necessarily the personal style of whether you're really controlling or whether you're more inclusive in decision-making. It sounds more like it's about your personal relationship with the president. So what, you laid it out, the main duties. Which of those are the hardest in terms of the things that you kind of laid out as the remit of the chief of staff? What for you was the most difficult?
The president should always attract the best and the brightest to work at the White House, and even if it's not true, everybody should believe it.
That was challenging, I guess.
And it's challenging because if you are truly one of the best and the brightest, you also have a very large ego. And part of the chief of staff's job is to make sure the ego doesn't get in the way of good counsel to the president. So I would say, candidly, the toughest part of the job was managing the personalities of these very competent people that the president hired so that they were not the president.
And when you say
They were
that,
advising the president.
and when you say that, who comes to mind? What anecdote surfaces?
Dick Cheney,
John Bolton.
John Rumsfeld,
Yeah.
John Bolton.
Yeah.
John Bolton, Condoleezza Rice, all very competent people. They're competent and confident.
So how do you have a memory of having to check someone a bit?
Many times.
Andy, you should have dealt with Dick Holbrook.
Seriously, the challenge there is that most people who go in to advise the president want their view to be the accepted view. And so if you have a dominant personality, you kind of crowd out some other meeker person in the room who is also just as competent. So I would police that, and maybe during a meeting, and I'd say, Sally really has more that she'd like to say. What do you think, Sally? Or I would say after the meeting to the president, you know, so-and-so kind of dominated the discussion. I know that Jim had a lot more to say, Mr. President. You might want to call Jim and see what he had to say. So those were sensitive things to do because you don't want to eliminate good counsel. You want to invite it, but you want to make sure the president is making the decision rather than being bullied into the decision or think that the decision is purely just the president's with no advice and counsel. He needs advice and counsel. We live in a pluralistic society. Actually, today we live in a my way or the highway society. I'd like us to live in a pluralistic society where there are different views. There should be different views. They should be heard and they should be debated.
Bill, does that resonate with you? Or what would you say was the hardest part? Does that sound similar?
Yeah, managing egos of the people that are on the staff or in the cabinet who always feel dissed because they've got some young kid at the White House who thinks they know more, and they may, than the cabinet person, and the cabinet person was either a governor or some sort of major player. And they always feel that nobody listens to them. And you've got a lot of talent in most of these cabinets. And they have egos because they've been around, most of them, for a long time. That's how they got the jobs. And I would say that was the most difficult. But I think Andy's absolutely right. Everybody in Washington is a AAA star, at least they think they are. And the competition is enormous. And you also know that probably 8 out of 10 people that you're dealing with and the staffer in the cabinet all think they could do a better job than you can do. And maybe they can. But managing those egos around the president is really tough.
I'll try with you. Anyone come to mind? Any
Yeah, but I'm
specific
not-
example that you might have of that? Maybe, an anecdote of the policy that was, where those egos got most
Well,
entwined.
President Obama was really good at, he would not let someone dominate a conversation. And he would go, like you go to church and you kind of hide in the back so nobody sees you. You could not do that in meetings with him. He would call on backbenchers, call them parliament, but staff people. The principals would say what they want, but President Obama was such that he would then kind of figure out, okay, who's staffing that principal, and then he'd ask them and put them on the spot for their opinion, which was awkward because you knew that person was thinking, geez, I'm going to maybe differ with my boss, who's the secretary, sitting at the table, and to tell the president the truth. But he was really good at that.
This sounds sort of exhausting, so let me ask you, President Clinton, he was known as a chatty fella. So, I mean,
Engaging, you mean engaging.
Did that dynamic impact what these gentlemen have described, or would you describe your challenge as completely different?
It did, and I would. I think for me, coming out of the business side and the politics as well, with President Clinton, who was engaging, big intellect, a lot of curiosity, a lot of energy, let's get all of it done, get it done in a hurry. No, Mr. President, we need to prioritize here. We've got to keep our eyes on the proverbial prize. If you look back in history, almost any president and any presidency is judged by peace and prosperity. Those are really the hallmarks of a successful presidency or an unsuccessful presidency. So that's the prize. And in our case, as Bill certainly remembers, President Clinton had only gotten 43% of the vote. Ross Perot got 19% of the vote as a third-party candidate. And President Bush 41 had the remaining of the vote, and it was somewhat of a surprise election, at least up until the last month, Andy, as you'll remember, because President Bush was such a gentleman, such a great man, great president, had the Gulf War and all of that. But the economy, it was the economy stupid, as James Carville pointed out in the campaign. So to me, the real prize was, number one, the president had run on the economy. We had to deliver on the economy, job creation, and rising tide lifting all boats. Secondly, this was a young governor from Arkansas who was not well known even after that campaign. So it was essential that he step on the world stage in a sure-footed manner as he met foreign leaders and dealt with foreign policy issues, i.e. peace and security and prosperity. And I'll remember forever, and all of these chiefs have gone through a similar process, Jennifer, and Mick made a great point about what cadence are you, what sequence are you when you're chief of staff? Is it at the beginning of a term or end of a term or second term? Mine was at the beginning of the Clinton-Gore presidency. But the night before the president takes the sacred oath of office, as Andy knows full well, having experienced 9/11 with President Bush, you are briefed on the nuclear codes and the passing of the football. That's a somber moment. In our case, General Colin Powell was head of the Joint Chiefs. And I assure you, General Powell, when he stepped in a room, filled it up immediately, both in stature and in intellect and presence. So the night before at the Blair House, General Powell is giving the security briefing to the president, the vice president, national security advisor, and me as chief of staff. And we discussed how many minutes you have to respond to a nuclear attack and the passing of the football. And I'll remember as long as I live, probably despite some loss of memory over time here, looking into the president's eyes, we kind of locked. It was like, this is the most sacred responsibility of any commander-in-chief. So I always felt, Jennifer, my job was to try to focus the president and the White House and the cabinet, keep our eyes on the prize, peace and prosperity. That was our goals. And I think truly, as a baby boomer, I did not, and a business person, I did not think we could balance the budget. I talked to the president about it. And Mick, of course, was OMB director. You understand it very, very well. But as we moved into the first term, the economy started to improve. We had low inflation, but real growth, increase in productivity. And all of a sudden, you begin to kind of whittle away at that deficit. So that, to me, were our goals.
Now, Mick, I don't know if you are going to share that view of managing people's opinions. If so, I'm curious about that, because at least the image of President Trump in the media was that he was a person who was very captive to the last person he spoke to. I don't know if that's true or not. You can truth squad that from your perch there, or was it something completely different that you found most challenging?
A lot of overlap again. I'll deal with the egos first, because you always deal with that in a White House, right? Because you're right, you have these huge egos in there, and I'll give a specific example, and I'll name names. I don't mind doing this. John Bolton, John Bolton was a very bright man. There's no question about one of the smartest I've ever met. Was never really able to convince him that he wasn't the president. And I'll give you a specific example. We were in Osaka, Japan, and for a variety of reasons, we ended up going at the last minute to the DMZ. We actually pulled that off. John was against that decision.
The demilitarized zone between North and
the
South
DMZ between
Korea.
North and South Korea on 16 hours notice. And John was against that decision, and was vehement as to, and laid out various reasons why he thought this was a bad decision. And the president said, "Thank you, John, we're going." And John left. John went to Mongolia instead. You can't do that, right? And that's when you knew it was time for John to go, because John was, if you're a member of this team, there's only room for one ego in that room, and it's the president's. Okay, and you have to, it has to be enough for you to recognize you're in the Oval Office having your piece, and you're saying your argument on something. And if the president agrees with you, yay for you. If the president doesn't agree with you, you're not the president. And managing that was real. I remember specifically that we had some other folks that fell in the same category, but John was the one who jumped out at me. My biggest challenge, really, though, it went through various phases. The biggest challenge at the beginning was to keep everybody from killing themselves or killing each other. It was a really, really tough place to work. John Kelly had not been to work the last 2 or 3 months of the job. The door was closed all the time. Everybody was out for him and herself in the West Wing, and it was one of the things I was set out to change. And so we had to, I spent most of my day, I'd meet the president in the morning, meet the president in the afternoon, and I spent most of my day walking around the West Wing trying to build a team, because they were not a team at that particular time. And once we got able to do that, I felt like we were in a really good place until the first impeachment. But for a while there, it did work. But it was a challenge because of where I was in the cycle. I wasn't at the very beginning, and I wasn't going into the re-elect. We were sort of there. I got there right after the midterms. With a specific goal of fixing the place. And that was the hardest thing to do, was to try and change the culture from sort of a brood of vipers to folks who are actually functioning as a team. And it worked. After that, then the challenge became fairly simple, which is how do you balance the crazies with the normal people? Because Trump liked all people. I heard that Clinton was the same. I think Obama was the exact opposite. I'm always curious if this is the case. Trump loved to have big groups in the office. And he wanted to have a debate on a topic. So if I used to joke that we would sell tickets to the trade discussions, because we'd have people over here on this side of the argument, people on this side of the argument, and Trump would sit back as the arbitrator, as the judge, and watch these people debate for an hour and a half. And sometimes there'd be 20 people in the Oval Office yelling at each other, which was great. It's what he wanted. My challenge was to make sure there was balance in the room, so that for everybody who was a staunch protectionist, I had a free trader, and that those people were relatively evenly matched intellectually in terms of ego and so forth, so that you had a good debate. I needed to make sure the president had the best information in front of him from all sides, so that he could make the best decisions.
That's an interesting policy issue for you to illustrate that for, because I've never had the impression that President Trump was remotely moved by, on that particular issue, an opposite side of his own views on trade. So did you feel he was absorbing and entertaining?
Look at the practical applications of it. He changed his mind on Australian tariffs on steel. Okay, and he did that as a result of a debate. And when I mean debate, I mean I thought Gary Cohn was going to kill Bob Lighthizer.
Can you describe the way you saw that occurring? I mean, what was happening in that moment?
It might have been the time that Cohn never grabbed him around the throat. But no, I mean, you could just tell these are grown men and women, and they are not shy. These are big egos and big intellects. In fact, one of the things that disappointed me about when I left is I tell people when we started the administration, the interior circle, the senior advisors to the president included the former CEO of ExxonMobil and the former president of Goldman Sachs. Okay, and say what you want to about their politics, those are real people. Okay. At the end, the inner circle included the guy who sells pillows at night on Fox News. Okay? I worked really hard to prevent that from happening. And then after I left, I think it happened.
Got that.
Jennifer, one quick PS on what makes, we're talking about egos. You covered the Congress. You also have big egos in the Senate and the House. Huge stakeholder. You can't get legislation through unless you have good rapport on the Hill. I used to have a $1 bet with the president when a senator would come in by himself. The two chairs there in the Oval Office, you've seen the picture a million times with the fireplace behind it. And the wager was, would the senator sit down in the chair before, the open chair, before the president offered it or not? I won 9 out of 10 bets.
And that's a good point, because it's your job. We think of you as interfacing with the president. Of course, that's the central role, but you have to do with the stakeholders and the cabinet members and the members of Congress, and Congress are essential, obviously, to almost any president's agenda. So that's an interesting point I would like to look into some more, too.
Just, first of all, I always view, Mick, to be honest with you, part of my job to keep the crazies out of the Oval Office.
Yeah.
But the egos, and we talked about...
You can't do that when they're the trade advisor.
Yeah,
so,
well, I could have put it off. The Congress, their egos are beyond anything. Well, due respect, Nick, especially the senators.
No offense taken, believe me.
And they really don't care about the president's future. It's all about them. So I came up with a brilliant idea that we should announce a reorganization plan as the prototype to get a reorganization of the federal government, because you may not agree, but it really doesn't work real well, okay? And so I worked for a long time with Jeff Zients, kind of quietly, came up with this great plan, and we had a prototype of all business, Commerce Department, small business, put it into a plan. And the Democrats had taken away from President Reagan the ability to reorganize by taking that power away from him, and he used to be able to put to Congress a plan. Here's a reorganization plan for the whole government, voted up or down. Okay? No amendments, up or down. So we came up with this brilliant plan. So the president does an event in the state dining room. Then the press and the whole thing, we had it was great. It was great. It filled up. Harry Reid calls like 5 minutes later. It ain't going anywhere.
Was he majority leader at the time?
Majority leader, Democrat in the Senate, and they were in control. Don't waste our time. Don't even bring that up here. I'm like, well, how about we just have a discussion about it, because everybody knows this thing ain't working real well. And we got a streamlined government, blah, 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 blah. And Max Baucus was the chairman. He calls me and he says, what is this? And I said, well, Max, all we want is a hearing, okay? Just no blinking way. The end. It was a great event. I probably got a tape at home of it, but that's as far as.
And that's your own. And that's your own party. I mean.
Yeah.
So.
The president liked the idea, but it was. The Congress said, "Don't even bother," and we couldn't preview it with them because they would have just shut it down before we even did it. But probably a strategic mistake on our part to think about it.
We talked about. You've all kind of mentioned that you have to be able to be a truth teller. You have to be able to tell the president something difficult message, or that they messed up, or something that they don't want to hear. So I would like to again go down the line with as much granular detail as you can possibly recall. What is an example of when you had, I'm not talking about, we'll get to the big one, but I'm talking about something where you just knew, he's not going to want to hear this, or he really screwed that up and he has no idea, and I'm going to have to tell him. What's that like when you have to deliver something that they don't want to hear?
you have to tell them, you don't want to hear this, but I'm going to tell it to you. And you have to be able to explain why you're doing it. And it could be 1,000 different things. It could be policy. It could be reacting to what is happening in Congress. Could be something reacting to what's going on in the United Nations. But you have to have the courage to say, as Mack McLarty would say, UFOs, unforeseen occurrences.
Yeah, for sure.
Or unintended consequences. And those are sometimes very difficult to bring into the office because you should be feeling a little guilty if there was an unintended consequence, because you should have had somebody on your team that expected that consequence. And so when it doesn't happen, does that mean heads will roll? No, it means people will be disappointed. You have to do work. You have to go up on Capitol Hill, solve a problem, maybe eat a meal of crow. I can't tell you how many meals of crow I ate over the years.
On the Hill.
In the Oval
Oh,
Office.
in the Oval Office.
So you acknowledge that you didn't do the job as well as you thought. We didn't think about this happening, and it happened.
Deb, do you have any examples there, Bill? And I would also, I'm curious, and I would ask all of this too, did President Obama, did he get more upset by you pointing out something he had done wrong, or just bringing garden variety bad news?
He was, as his public image was, very cool. He did not fluctuate in based upon news. He was always very steady. And I think in addition to the things that Andy said, oftentimes you have to come and tell them something about a person in the government, in the cabinet, in the administration who's done something bad, and you've got to take some action on them. And that's awkward, especially if they're good friends of the president. But he was very steady all the time. It was pretty
You have no
amazing.
memory of him blowing his top?
Not like our friend Bill Clinton.
Yes, right. I was
And
thinking that.
I don't know President Trump, but from what I read, he sometimes is blowing his top. So I no, he nothing like President Clinton. If you were in the room with President Clinton, and it was quite a scene. And you wanted to get to the door quickly.
When did you want to run for the door?
Not too often, because I knew him well.
Only when it was open.
Yeah, exactly. But again, I had not worked with him when he was governor, so it was a different type of relationship. In my case, we talked about the familiarity and the trust and respect. The President Clinton was obviously and is a very, very smart, intuitive person. So he could kind of immediately read me when I came into the room, the Oval Office there, 101. Okay, go ahead and give me the bad news. I mean, he could just see he knew me well enough, probably what I was there to, maybe not the subject, but probably the tone or substance of the news. Secondly, he would kind of like a summer thunderstorm. He would have a little temper moment there, and then it would kind of calm back down a little bit later. And, I would, again, because of the relationship, and he knew, I was trying to get things done in the right way, even doing my best, not always leading. But when he would kind of have that, and then people would kind of leave, I would say, well, are you finished? And, and he would accept that. I mean, he would say, yes, I am. So that's kind of the way I handled it. I think the moment I remember, not necessarily real bad news, but President Clinton coming out of the campaign where he would linger with each and every voter to the last dog died, as he put it. That was a real attribute in the campaign, not so much Andy in the Oval Office with running on time. President Clinton did not run on time, and I just got so frustrated with that. So finally one day, Mick, I went in there in the afternoon, he was doing his mail, and I said, Mr. President, it was a brilliant speech this morning. It was so well organized, just so tight. I just don't see how your mind can work in that ordered a manner and be so disorganized personally. I just don't understand it. And he looked over his half glasses, and I said, well, I see I made you mad. And he said, oh, no, you've just hurt my feelings. So, that was the point I was trying to make. He got a little better, and he did get better over the 8 years. He did get better over the 8 years, and needed to.
Mick, did you ever see President Trump lose his temper?
No, I never saw it. In fact, I've commented a couple times when I read all these stories about throwing food, and I was around the man a lot, and that was not the president I saw. Whether or not he was different after I left, that I can't speak to. I never saw that. I can count on one hand the number of times I actually went in, closed the door, and said, Mr. President, we have a problem. We can't do this, okay? Because I knew that he wouldn't react positively to that. If you told the president, you can't do this, he'd push back and say, yes, we can. I understood his personality, I understood the dynamic. I had to do it a couple times because you don't have a choice. And since I did it so infrequently, when I did it and I closed the door, I said, I need to talk to you, he knew it was serious and he took it very seriously. But there was several dozen times where we knew we had to convince him not to do something. And I knew how to do that, which is, okay, we have to get this person to say this is a bad idea. This person, they have to be a friend of his, a family member, somebody on TV, and 3 members of Congress, okay? I can't tell you the number of times I called Sean Hannity and said, look, this is what we're thinking about doing. That's a terrible idea. Well, if you can say that on the show tonight, then that'll help. This is how people think. You have to learn how to talk to people in the language they understand. Okay, and you have to. One of the beauties, one of the keys to success at everything is getting people to think that everything is their own idea.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and that's what we did. That's what you had to do with Trump. You couldn't walk in and tell him you can't do this. He'd look at you and go, "Are you the president?" And the answer to that question, of course, is no. I'm not the president. Okay. Now, a couple times you have to go in because you have a choice. But over the course of a day or two, if our policy is X, we think it's a mistake. We treat it like the ocean crashing on the shore. And if the waves hit the same tone a couple times, then all of a sudden it's his idea, and now we've changed, we're off on the right direction. So you have to learn how to do that. That's not, by the way, that's just good advice in life generally. I mean, I do that with my wife. Kids, go over and tell mom we can't do this. Okay, that's a great idea.
It's a consensus building of sorts.
I'm sorry?
It's kind of a consensus building, I guess, of sorts.
You just have to understand how people communicate, what language they listen to, and how they react. There are certain people, especially presidents have egos. You don't run for president if you don't have a big ego. And if you try and go head to head with that too many times, you're gonna, first of all, you end up out of a job and not very effective, but more importantly, you won't get the right decisions.
So we're going to go to Q&A in a second. There's a mic over there. You can start lining up. Remember that we give priority to our students. This is a lightning round. I'm going to go through it really fast, but I don't want to miss this question. There's an iconic photo that was used in this event, and it's not only that we used it to advertise this event. I think you were showing me this photo of you delivering the news to President Bush that the United States had been attacked, that the World Trade Center had been hit by an airplane while he was having an event at an elementary school. It's an iconic image for a reason, because it's considered, one of the worst moments in modern history, and obviously that you're in it and that you're in that moment. Was that the worst day of your life in that job? And if not, what was?
Do you remember when George H.W. Bush threw up on the Japanese prime minister?
That was not a good day. That was a bad day.
I was chief of staff on that trip, too.
That was a bad day. Okay. Bill Daley.
The best day, flip it.
Okay.
The best day was I'll stick with the negative. When we were observing the Osama bin Laden raid, and when the helicopter began to go twirl and had to abort, Bob Gates at one of the first meetings had said, whatever the military says, and he was Secretary of Defense, we shouldn't do this raid, and this has all been public, because I sat here when Jimmy Carter was going to do the Tehran rescue, and Murphy's Law, if it can go wrong, it would go wrong. As I saw that helicopter begin to twirl, I thought, oh, shoot, here goes. But then it flipped. The total opposite then happened. It's enormous success for the world.
The worst day, I think, was the Oklahoma City bombing in the White House. That's when I felt the fabric of our nation had changed, and it just was so out of the complete, unimaginable happening. The president, of course, really engaged on that with a Republican governor from Oklahoma, Frank Keating, who really helped heal the state, the city of Oklahoma City, the state of Oklahoma, and the nation. And that was, I think, it was such a sobering moment where you just shook, but it turned into be a good moment for the country. I think the best day was when you saw the economy getting better and you had a chance to really make substantial progress on the national deficit, which eventually led to a balanced budget on a bipartisan basis. And Jennifer, I think the best day likely for all of us is when you meet someone, usually on the campaign trail or an event, where you have worked on a particular policy and you have helped change someone's life welfare to work, and they tell you their story about a single mother and the impact it's had. That's really why you go into public service.
Mick, you get the last word. Worst day on your job?
I don't remember a worst day or best day. I don't remember. We were blessed. We didn't have any of those great tragedies because we had too many shootings and so forth, but nothing stands out, obviously, like 9/11 or the Oklahoma City bombing. I don't remember any particularly great days. As I sit up here, I do remember that sinking feeling one time that things are getting ready to go really badly very quickly, but it turned out fine, so I can talk about it, which is that when we went to the DMZ, we only had about 2 minutes to brief the president on what he was supposed to do. And if you watch it on video, do it sometime, it's fun. He was supposed to go to the border, shake hands with Kim Jong-un. He was supposed to step over the border, shake hands, and then walk back into South Korea across the border. The border's a wall about that tall to have the meetings. And he walked the wrong way. And I'm sitting in the glass doors watching the back of the president walk into North Korea. And I turned to the head of the Secret Service and said, I said, what do we do now? And he goes, Chief, we don't do anything. I said, what? He goes, well, I forgot to tell you, but the deal we cut with the North Koreans was we got the president in North Korea, the interpreter, the photographer, and one Secret Service agent. If we send anybody else, we're invading North Korea. And he walked over and starts gesticulating at the North Korean building, and then he comes back and they walk in the South Korean building to have the meetings. And I didn't get a chance, about 2 hours afterwards, to talk to him. I said, boss, I got to ask you, what was that all about? He goes, did you see that building? Did you see that building? That was the ugliest building. I said, look, Kim, we got to go look at this building. Look at this building. You folks have got the greatest piece of real estate in the world. You got coasts down both sides. You got China up here. You got South Korea down here. You could be doing resorts, golf courses, casinos, but not with a building like that. Now look at that building. That's South Korea. That is a fabulous building. Let's go have a meeting. And he walked back over to have the meeting. So
you have a career ahead. You have a career ahead.
That's exactly right.
I'm glad that wasn't almost your worst day. Okay, so we have a mic over here. Again, students, please identify yourself, say your name and your year, and make sure that your question ends in a question mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, I'm Jared Lowry in the business school, graduating this June. Thank you all for being here. So given all the talented folks and maybe folks with big egos that you worked with over your time in politics, your long careers, I'm curious who you think was the best American leader, maybe post-1960, who never even ran for president, but should have, and why do you think they should have?
Oh, wow.
That's a great question. That's a great question.
That's a tough question.
Yeah, it really is.
Anyone want to take that? Why don't we put a pin in that?
Boy, you may have stumped us here.
There's a lot of good ones to make sure we don't.
Ran but lost and should have won, you know.
Why don't we go to the next question? Put a pin in that. If it occurs to anybody, we'll surface back. Go ahead.
All right, my name is Yang. I'm a graduate student in sociology. So you talked about managing ego. That's on the confidence side. But what about the other side, which is insecurity? I read a memo by Henry Kissinger. He did a lot managing insecurity of Nixon. And I wonder if Chief of Staff is in a better position to manage insecurity, whether just a division of labor by different staffers or
That's a great question.
you are the confidant of the president.
I think you have to convey, obviously, a positive attitude and be very supportive of the president, because it's very easy in this job to get down and be down a lot, even though it's an enormous honor and challenge. But again, there's so much bad that comes into this place, because if it's good and easy to solve, somebody else is going to solve it and take credit for it. So there is a bit of, you've got to make sure that, and I think as Mick said, moving with the staff, especially the young people, they read the press, they see the press, they get down. That mood can be very infectious in a White House, negativity. So you've got to try to boost everybody up and be positive, With the president, one-on-one, that it could be a little different. But
All of us have had a phenomenal privilege to greet the president when they come to work.
right.
And I used to greet the president optimistically, say it's a great day, I'm glad you're the president, even if it was a really lousy day. Why? Because you don't want a pessimist as a president. You don't want to have a leader that says, follow me and things will get worse. And you don't want a leader who tells those who are working in government that their job is not going well. You want to lift them up. So I think it's an important job for the chief of staff to be motivating positive action rather than inviting people to slip into despair.
Cool. Well, thank you. Next question.
Plus, there's no shortage of people who want to beat the president up.
Yeah, I do think, Jennifer, the question does, I think, raise the right point that you, on West Wing, the series that was so popular for many years, it did capture the White House pretty well, except they had a script. None of us had a script. We had to kind of do it in real time. But you do have, I certainly noticed coming from business, you have real highs where you have good moments, and then you have real challenges and lows, and you have to try to even those out.
That's the job, isn't it? I used to tell people, it's like, they said, what's the job like? Like, it's like any other job, which you have really good days, really bad days. It's, the difference is the good days are that much higher than the ordinary good day, and the bad days are that much lower than the ordinary bad days.
That makes sense.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Noor, and I'm third year in the college. I'm curious, have you ever felt a strong conflict where you felt serving the president as a person differed from serving the interests of the American people? And if so, how did you navigate that?
Great question.
I mean, I get asked that a lot of time because of the reputation that Trump has. He never asked anything that I considered to be immoral. Certainly never asked anything to be illegal. I never faced those challenges. I talked to students here, putting a plug in for my seminar, 3:30 on Mondays. No, it never put us in a position like that.
But Mick, you did resign on January 6th.
But well, January 6th is different. That's right. I mean, I wasn't chief of staff at the time, so you're absolutely right. I mean there's a longer discussion for another day. Keep in mind, he's our boss, right? Whether or not you think there was something illegal and criminal on January 6th, whether or not you think there's something impeachable, this is not the place to have the debate. He failed me as my boss on that particular day, did not meet my expectations as the man who was in charge of my organization. And if that's the case, either you can't fix it, you can't make it better, you have a choice, which is either stay and have people assume you approve of this or leave in order to make it clear that you didn't. That's a different thing than on a daily basis. Yeah, let's go do this. Let's do this. Let's do this immoral thing. No, never saw any of that. I don't know if you guys did. I doubt you did. So.
I think all three questions have been excellent so far. I think it's one thing if you disagree on a policy and lose the discussion, but I think, not to at all sound self-righteous or anything, I think any of us, frankly, certainly speaking on for myself, had you felt that way, I think you'd be compelled to resign. I think President Clinton knew that about me.
I never even came close to having thought of that.
Yeah.
But you want to address the first question?
I want to go back to that first question.
I'm struggling with
I
that one.
can.
Have you got a good answer for that one?
Well, I don't know if it's a good answer, but I've been thinking who is somebody in my lifetime that didn't become president that could have, no doubt in my mind, changed the course of history was Bobby Kennedy. I think of all the people that, now obviously he ran and was assassinated, but I think that was the most impactful on changing history in my lifetime as somebody who didn't get the chance to get the job and would have had he lived, in my opinion.
I'd throw Colin Powell was someone I had great respect for.
Yeah.
Had the vision from inside the government and had been on the receiving end of presidential decisions, and then was Secretary of State, so he had great comments around the world.
Andy and I were thinking exactly alike.
Hi, my name is Ella. I'm a first year in the college. And I'm curious, how religion impacted your relationship with the president, and from your inside perspective, how did religion actually influence the president's day-to-day decision-making?
Great question.
I'd be glad to answer that. Full disclosure, my wife is a Methodist minister. So I come from strong faith. I cannot imagine doing the jobs that we did or that the president does without practicing some faith, because the burdens are so great and the decisions have such great consequences that I do think that you want the comfort of having solicited counsel beyond that which would come from a person in the room. So the presidents I worked for, President Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, all practiced their faith. They did it in different degrees. George W. Bush was probably the most disciplined at doing it. There's a document that all of us would see every day called the President's Daily Brief. Top secret, everybody in Washington wants to see it. It's a need to see, not a want to see. And we had the need to see it. The president had the need to see it. And I don't know what it was like for you guys, but anything on the president's desk, I would see before it went on the president's desk.
Yep.
And so I would read that document, and then I would greet the president when he came to work, and I was very impressed. That document was there, the fancy cover on it. Everybody wants to see it. The president would come in, sit down in this chair behind the Resolute desk, open a drawer, take out a devotional, read from it, take out another devotional, read from it, take out the Bible, read something from it, close the drawer. I believe he prayed, and then he would pick up the PDB and read it. So I think faith plays a big role in making tough decisions.
Trump is very different and somewhat the same. Probably one of the least religious people I've ever met in my entire life, but was fascinated by faith and somehow managed to surround himself with a West Wing of mostly devout, daily communicant Roman Catholics, including myself. I mean, there's 6 or 8 of them. And he was fascinated by people of faith and would want to talk about faith all the time. He used to invite me and Larry Kudlow, who is a Jewish convert to Catholicism, to come in and sit on one side of the room, and then Bill Barr and Pat Cipollone. Again, these are all folks who would go to daily mass, and he would talk to us about why we disagree on the death penalty. And how is it that some Roman Catholics like myself and Larry are against the death penalty, and some who go to church just as much like Bill and Pat are for the death penalty, and was fascinated by it. He also allowed us, for the first time in history, to have Mass on the campus. We had Catholic Mass on the campus for the first time, and the only time in history. And once we started doing that, they started having Jewish services and Muslim services on the campus of the White House for the first time ever, from the least religious person ever. So I know people criticize him for not knowing what 2 Corinthians is, and I get that, but he was encouraging to people of faith, which I found very productive.
Is there one of you?
President Obama was very private, as those of you who know him, about his religion. He went, a strong believer in faith, and it was, in my opinion, a big piece of his, as he went through life and decision making. But he was not out putting it out on his sleeve in any way, shape, or form.
President Clinton and at that time First Lady Hillary Clinton, my wife and Don and I were very well aware that Hillary had been so active in the First Methodist Church in Little Rock. The President had been a very active member of the choir in Emmanuel Baptist Church in Little Rock, so we were very familiar with their journey and the depth of their faith. They were both, I think, did a nice job of kind of picking up, make a bit on your point. We would have at least 4 times a year, usually at the beginning of each season, a very broad gathering, not a presidential prayer breakfast, but a smaller gathering, but of all faiths and so forth. And it had a wonderful feel, and that was a way to send the right message in the right way, I thought, to the staff of the White House, and it kind of put things in a perspective that was needed.
We'll try to get to a few more. Go ahead, please.
My name is Artur. I'm a first year in the college. Chief of Staff Mulvaney, recently, like just now, you talked about how you resigned after January 6th. Mm-hmm. In an interview after that resignation, you said that Donald Trump wasn't the same as he had been 8 months prior. In that vein, I'm curious to hear how you feel he changed, and to all of you, how you think your president's changed in terms of like personality or energy over your time on the job.
I think he got tired of having people tell him what he didn't want to hear. And he started to replace the people who were honest with him and replaced him with people who would, if he had an idea, it was always, yes, sir, Mr. President, I think that's a great idea. Let's have a rally on January 6th. Oh, Mr. President, I think that's the best idea ever. And I don't think there was anybody giving the other side, because I think, and the presidents are ultimately responsible for their staffers. Okay, they just are. But I think he was getting really, really bad advice. Keep in mind, the president is probably the single most isolated and insulated person in the world. Maybe the Pope, I'm not sure, okay? But you rely so heavily on your staff because you're no longer a normal human being, and you don't interact with the real world. And you have to have staff that will be open and honest with you and be your conduit to the outside world. And if they fail in that role, then you are at risk of making tremendously poor decisions. So whether or not it was Trump's fault, staff's fault, obviously it's his fault because he's responsible at the end of the day for everything. But I do blame the staff for a lot of the breakdowns of in the last days of the Trump administration.
You know, I would say that obviously people who get to the presidency have long relationships with lots of people, and they call on people for advice. But it's very, and I remember with President Clinton, when I was in the cabinet with him, he was constantly engaging people outside of the system that he had a history with for their advice.
Great point.
And President Obama did the same. But those people who suddenly, as opposed to us who dealt with the president every day, they get a call from the president and ask their opinion on something. As I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to get people to really be honest with the president because, you know, the White House puts the call through, everybody kind of goes in a meltdown, and you're talking to the president, not to Bill Clinton, who you knew for 30 years, except a guy like Mack in that role. So the judgment they get from friends and people they've engaged with over the years is not as good, in my opinion, because they don't give the honest opinion they may have given when the person was a governor, congressman.
Yeah, I'm reminded we were on the elevator there, and the steward took us up to the wrong floor, totally inadvertently. We got off. It was a huge room. The First Lady was having a reception there, and this man ran over to the president, and of course everybody kind of gravitated that way. He said, "Oh, Mr. President, sorry, there are a lot of people here." And President Clinton didn't even blink. He said, "Yes, I know. I used to be one." and it is a bubble. It is a bubble and isolation. I think in terms of President Clinton, the 6.5 years I was in the White House, I think most presidents, you know, come to the office, you know, with experience for sure, great talent, great drive, but they all, I think, have to learn and change on the job. They all have to grow if they're going to be a successful president. And they're human beings. We all do that. You do it as students, and you grow. And so I watched that with President Clinton, and he had that capacity, and I think it served him well.
Hello, my name is Nai Walker. I'm a freshman in the college. My question is about impeachment. Two of you were chiefs of staff to presidents during their impeachment, and I'm curious about what the kind of day-to-day operations were like during those times and how they differed from other parts of the presidency.
Well, I'll defer to Mick because I was not in the White House when he was in during the impeachment. So
it broke the West Wing. And one of my fears is that it is now going to be used as a tool going forward on a regular basis because the opposition party has figured out that if you want to frustrate a president's agenda, you can take up a lot of time and a lot of energy by doing an impeachment. And it certainly broke us. I to this day believe that our response to COVID was negatively impacted by the fact that we were completely worn out and beaten up by the impeachment. Two things, by the way, coincided almost perfectly. We had a press conference, the first press conference on COVID, the same day that the final vote on the Senate impeachment took place. In fact, nobody came to the presser on COVID because they were all covering the impeachment. And my fear is that now my party will do it to them, they will do it to us, and it will become an ordinary tool. It was extraordinarily stressful. I remember one time, this is not an impeachment question, it deals with the Mueller report. I had an idea of something I wanted to do over at the CFPB that was consistent with the president's agenda, and I went over to talk to the then White House counsel, and I said, look, I don't think I can do this on my own, but if you guys back me, I think we can do this, and I think it's entirely in line with what the president wants me to do over there. And he looks at me and goes, Mick, I am up to here with Mueller. I don't have time for this crap. So we didn't do it. It is a tremendous energy sink. I mean, it will drain a White House and can rip it apart. And I think that happened to us. I don't know what it was like in the Clinton White House, but my guess is it's a very stressful, intense type of time, even when you know what the result is going to be. And we knew what the result was going to be. There was no way that the Senate was going to kick Donald Trump out of office. But even with that knowledge, it was still very, very difficult.
If you can ask a question in 30 seconds, and I can get these guys to answer it in about as much, you can have the last.
All right, thank you very much. So my question is, how does the role change during re-election season, if at all?
Well, I wasn't there. I left before the re-election, but especially these days, it dominates that whole last year, and nothing. And I think you'll see this year with President Biden, it is all-consuming. When the president travels, and they're usually out on average 3-4 days a week now, in those 8 states that matter, it dominates everything, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You were there for a while, really.
I think the biggest change is not around the elections. It's the reality that there is social media now that is ubiquitous, instantaneous, and people get stuck on stupid really fast. And so that's the biggest change in terms of the context of the White House being able to function, because so many people now use adjectives and adverbs more than they use nouns and verbs.
20 seconds, Mick, you want to?
I was there. I left in March of 2020. We had just started the re-elect campaign. We had data in January of 2020 when we believed that the Democrat nominee was going to be Bernie Sanders, that we were going to win 40 states, including New Jersey. And it just goes to show you how quickly things can change.
Well, this has been really great. I appreciate the time of all you gentlemen. It was really interesting and really fun. And I thank all of you for coming out on a beautiful night in Chicago. And hope to see you soon again at the next IOP Speakers event. Thank you, guys. Thank you, sir. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you, sir.